Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series. And in this one, I'm going to go over my round 2 game from the Chess Max Academy GM Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 1 video, you know that I lost a really heartbreaking game against Grandmaster Oliver Barbosa because I'd been essentially defending a fortress position for 90 moves and then kind of collapsed right at the end after 124 moves. And the crazy thing about it was that there were 2 rounds a day in this event, and I actually had just 2 minutes before the next round started. And so I really had to kind of decompress extremely quickly and then kind of, be ready to play my next game because it was a quick turnaround. And my round 2 opponent was no slouch either. It turned out my round 2 opponent was Grandmaster Mark Paragua, who's also a Filipino player that is living in New York. I've played him many times over the years, and if you follow the Road to Grandmaster channel, you know that I played him in a tournament in one of the FIDE weekenders I played at the Marshall Chess Club. So the last matchup was a good memory. I beat him with black, and I was hoping now with the white pieces to kind of, turn my bad start around and kind of just, play a better game, given the circumstances of the first one. Now, I was also exhausted, so it was really tough to just figure out how do I attack this guy when I've literally just played a 6-hour game. So I was gonna just try and play steady and not play anything too critical and just kind of see what happens. So that was my game plan going into this one. So without further ado, let me get into it. So I opened with d4, and Mark played knight f6, and after knight f3, d5. I know that Mark is typically a Slav player, sometimes a Queen's Gambit decline player. And again, I wanted to play something that was not too theoretical, so I actually played the move c4, but after e6, I played the move e3. And e3 is not a very popular move. In fact, it's actually quite tepid usually, but it's something I've employed over the course of 2019 many times, and the idea was just to kind of get some development, not play anything too critical, and then see what happens. Black now played the move a6, and this is a funny little move because I actually faced this against, I think it was Grandmaster Eric Hansen in the Open Portugal event in February. And the idea with a6 is that if I develop my bishop, let's say to e2 or to d3, white will, basically be forced to deal with d takes e4, and after bishop takes e4, b5. And now you can see how this a6 move is made quite useful because black gets in b5 with tempo hitting the bishop, and then black plays his own bishop to b7 and plays for the c5 break. And in my opinion, these positions are already easier to play for black, and black's already equalized. In part because I wasted 2 tempe with the bishop e2 and bishop d3 maneuver, but also because I didn't really put any pressure on black's center. So here, after a6, I believe when I played against Eric Hansen, I think I actually wound up taking on d5 at some point very quickly. But in this one, I decided to play the move b3. And the idea is essentially to just keep the tension in the position, because now if d takes c4 is played, I will strongly consider playing b takes c4. And the point is that I maintain my nice pawn setup in the center. And I think white has quite a playable position. So after b3, it's already quite an original position because a6 is not a move that's super popular against e3. B3 in response to it is also fairly unusual. So there's only about 20 or so games in that database from just this position, which is unique in chess. Normally you don't get an original position so quickly. But after b3, black took the liberty of playing bishop b4 check. And this is a very interesting move because it kind of takes advantage of the fact that I've kind of weakened this diagonal sufficiently so that I can't just block with the knight. And it's a move that actually happens quite a bit in, you could say, in Catalan type of setup. So there's circumstances where there's like knight f3 and bishop b4 check, and I'll show that. So let's say e6, c4, d5, g3 in the Catalan, the most popular move here is actually bishop b4 check. And the idea is actually to disturb white's development, because if you block with the knight, the c4 pawn is hanging and will be captured. And if you block with the bishop on d2, then the bishop goes back to e7 and argues that the bishop on d2 is quite misplaced. So essentially, Mark took this theme and employed it in a totally different setup, which is, quite interesting. And after bishop b4, I was familiar with the idea of, bishop d2 and then the bishop running back to e7. And I was like, I don't know if I want to allow that, because it seems like I'm not really getting too much. And so I elected to play knight b d2 and, argue that maybe the bishop on b4 is actually misplaced. And maybe if I put my knight on d2, I'm not going to have to waste a tempo rerouting the bishop later that would have been on d2 instead, and can just put it on b2 and have a quite pleasant position. So it's already quite an interesting position, because I'm basically blocked with knight b d2, and I'm saying, well, what's the point of bishop b4 check then? So Mark now actually played the move c5, and I think this was an attempt to justify the position of the bishop on b4. I think there was actually some game where black actually tried to play bishop c3, but I do believe this is actually quite risky, because I think black has some problems to solve if the bishop actually gets caught out here. Like if I move my rook to b1, what is the bishop really doing if I manage to challenge it again with queen c2? And I was actually wondering during the game whether there's a circumstance where I can actually go bishop a3 and sacrifice the exchange, point being that, in this type of position, black wouldn't be able to castle just yet because the bishop's controlling the diagonal. Although maybe this is, a little bit too much. I wasn't, seriously considering going for this, but I did really look at it. I gave it a look during the game when it was my turn. I was like, well, after bishop c3, I might have some dynamic choices. But instead, bishop c3 was not played, c5 was played. And now there's some tension in the center, because one of the other things that's kind of annoying for white if you block with the knight or the bishop on d2 is that the queen lacks connection with the pawns in the center. And so black's kind of striking now to take advantage of that and potentially create an isolani or just to create some targets. And so if I do nothing, if I play a move like bishop e2, I think now c takes d4 is actually quite desirable, because if I play e takes d4, then black will get to play against my hanging pawns. And if I play knight takes d4, this knight is actually kind of misplaced on the d4 square. Black might be able to play e5 in some lines, but also the knight will wind up having to move back to f3 at some juncture, because it's not particularly secure here. So because of that, I actually decided to play the move d takes c5 and not give black the opportunity to play c takes d4 himself. Now black actually castled, which makes sense because the c5 pawn is going to be lost regardless. And now I played the move bishop b2, just getting this bishop, that diagonal is drawn quite poorly, but getting the bishop along the diagonal so that I can essentially get some pressure down that way and just continue my development. After bishop b2, Mark took on c4, and now I played the move bishop takes c4, and I was actually quite happy with some scenario like this, because now I actually didn't take two moves to get my bishop to c4. In a lot of moments, you play bishop e2, and then you play bishop takes c4, and, black basically says that white lost a half tempo, but by taking on c4 right away, I didn't lose that half tempo, and I thought that was kind of beneficial. And all of a sudden, my bishops are both developed. This one on c4 is not going to stay there, because on that diagonal, it's typically not that great because it's biting on granite here. But the fact that I have both of my bishops kind of pointing towards the king side, and this one might reroute itself to d3, I thought was quite promising. So after bishop c4, bishop takes c5 was played. And now I played the move queen c2, and this was essentially my idea once I got to the setup, was I thought that in the symmetrical position, white is actually a tiny bit better, because if you just look at, the difference in the position right now, black is castled, and I'm not castled yet, but I already have two more pieces developed than black does. I have a knight on d2, and I have a bishop on b2, and those are actually quite important differences because both of black's queenside minors are still at home. So I thought this might give me some chances. So after queen c2, black played knight bd7, kind of, following suit with my development. You can see it's nearly symmetrical, but I still have a little bit of an edge with respect to my bishop and queen being developed on the queen side and black not having that luxury. And after knight bd7, I now castled. And here's kind of the critical position for black, because essentially, again, if you look at this position, I'm actually two tempos up in the symmetrical position, which you should think would give white something to play for. And it turned out that it did after black's move. So black actually has to be really, really precise here to kind of make sure he doesn't get into trouble being multiple tempos down. And the move that he played, b6, actually does not fit the bill. It turns out that the best move in the position is actually queen e7. And the idea is that the queen is actually quite snug on e7. It can't be challenged by a rook on the c or d file anymore. Actually, the queen coming to c7 would not be very accurate. And then it also protects the bishop on c5, so there's some tactical opportunities sometimes for white, where after a discovery, the queen might actually be hitting the bishop on c5. Not the case anymore with the queen on e7. So queen e7 would be the best way to play. And then, believe it or not, even though white has this little symmetrical, symbolic edge in development, black would really be fine, in part because the queen on c2 is actually not ideally placed in the long term because the rook will come to c8 and challenge it. And so black would be okay here. Instead, after b6, there's a little bit of a tactical issue connected to the rook on a8 being undefended, and it's the move knight e4. And all of a sudden, not only am I hitting the bishop on c5, but it's actually extremely undesirable to take on e4 now, because after knight takes e4, queen takes e4, my queen's hitting the rook on a8, and this gives me the opportunity to transfer my queen to the king side if need be. So for instance, let's say black plays rook b8. Now I can play bishop d3, threatening a checkmate on h7. And already this is quite difficult to parry, but after the, you can't play knight f6 because bishop takes f6, and you can't, the only real way to defend it would be to play g6. And here I have my bishop on the right diagonal, and I have my queen that can nudge itself perhaps to f4 and get to h6 and really, basically checkmate black, because essentially he's not going to be able to develop his piece in time to defend against all these threats. So really, it's just this little slight edge based on the symmetrical position where I have a slight opportunity to kind of take advantage of the circumstances. And after knight e4, because of the knight takes e4, queen takes e4 line, black pretty much needs to play bishop b7. But this move actually is losing. Believe it or not, the position is actually lost for black. I played the move that actually did not get it done, though. So why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out white to play and win, because believe it or not, it is a winning position for white. All right, so hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and kind of work out some of the details. As it turns out, the move that wins is actually not the move I played, knight takes c5. That's what I played, just trying to get the bishop pair. Instead, it's the move knight takes f6 check. And the idea is that after knight takes f6, white has the move knight g5. And all of a sudden, again, there's bishop takes f6 and queen takes h7 mate ideas, and they're really, really difficult to parry. One of the huge problems is that if you play g6, which seems like the only move to shut down the queen's diagonal to h7, white can first play rook f d1 with tempo, and then if the knight goes to d5, to just try and block that stuff, I can actually play the move h4. And in these types of positions now, there are two threats for white. One of the threats is e4, just picking up a piece because the queen is pinned. And when the queen steps away to e7, really the only move, then there's knight e4. And as you can see with these arrows, the threat is basically rook takes d5 or bishop takes d5 in conjunction with knight f6 check. And the batteries and the discoveries on that diagonal with the dark squares being so weak is just decisive. The only real way to try to defend those dark squares would be to do something like f6, but you're not going to last long in a position like this. So really the position is losing if I play knight takes f6 and give up and then play knight g5. But I think, again, part of the dynamic here is I was kind of reluctant to give up my bishops for something that wouldn't be completely forcing, and I just did not see one move down the line after g6. I just kind of missed the promise and continuation after rook a d1 and h4, and it was just a gross oversight because I was looking at ideas with knight g5, but I didn't see that I should give up my bishop to do that, and so a little bit of bias perhaps working against me. Instead, I played knight takes c5 because that was kind of the simpler continuation. If I didn't see the knockout blow, I did think that having the two bishops would be a nice safe advantage. But the issue here is that after knight takes c5, white is better, but black has really good control of the e4 square, and because of that, he's going to have pretty decent counterplay in the position. And the other issue is that I have multiple pieces now that are kind of misplaced, namely the bishop on c2 and the queen on c2. Because now that I've kind of helped black's knight spring to life, rook c8 is going to be a problem hitting my queen on the long diagonal. And as I've mentioned before, the bishop on c4 is hardly a long-term solution on that square because it's just biting on granite on that diagonal. So if I'm better here, or if I want to be better here and, convert some type of advantage, I have to kind of, maneuver on the back ranks, which allows black to kind of build up a potential initiative. Because right now, all my play is based on long-term assets. But in the short term, I have to really be quite careful. So after knight c5, I went rook fd1, challenging the queen. I thought that was reasonable. And after queen e7, it's kind of a critical position to figure out how to, consolidate my position and kind of develop so that I can get that long-term edge. And unfortunately, I did not do this in the cleanest way. It's kind of ironic because we spoke about how strong this knight g5 move was. It turns out that even in this position, knight g5 is the best move. And here it does not have the same checkmating venom as in previous lines with bishop takes f6 and queen takes h7. Because black will be able to parry that with knight e4. But the idea here is that I actually get a pair of minor pieces off the board, which gets me closer to this endgame where the two bishops can kind of show their strength. And by exchanging a minor piece that actually is controlling the e4 square, I also give myself a better chance of actually controlling it in the long run. And so in this position after knight takes e4, after rook a c1, I'm actually going to get quite close to consolidating because after rook a c8, I'll go queen e2, and then play a well-timed bishop d3, and then eventually play f3 and e4, and hopefully block out the bishop on the light diagonal from a8 to h1 and kind of consolidate. So, yeah, so instead, I didn't do that. I played the move knight e5, and I thought this was a way to kind of take space in the middle, but I'm not challenging black on the e4 square. I'm just kind of ceding that square, and this becomes a real avenue for black counterplay. Black now played the move rook a c8, lining the rook up against the queen on c2, and now I went queen d2 to step out the way. And then b5 was played, and you can see here that black's essentially getting multiple moves in with tempo, which is kind of annoying for me. I went bishop f1 retreating, and then after knight e4, we get another move with tempo, and now I played the move queen a5, which on the face of it looks extremely risky because my queen is basically straying far from the nest, and a lot of times attacks tend to work eventually when the queen is far away from the king, and you could see here that it's far away from the king. Now, it turns out a better move would have been queen e1, and in part, it's based upon that principle of the queen being closer to the king, the king is more secure. But the reason I rejected it was because of rook c2. I was essentially wary of certain lines where there was rook c2 and takes on f2, and also the bishop on b2 was hanging. So I essentially thought that I was just losing material here, but it turns out that after knight d3 and knight takes f2, which I thought would just win material because if I take on f2 now, there's rook takes b2. It turns out here that I can play the intermediate move, bishop takes f6, and this actually means that I win a piece because the queen on e7 is hanging, and this would actually just be winning for white. So it actually turns out that queen e1 works because I have this knight d3 move later. So anyways, after queen a5, knight d5 was played. Note that rook c2 right now doesn't work because I have bishop a3. That was the concept, is that I'm actually skewering the queen and the rook on that diagonal. So knight d5 was played, dealing with that, because now bishop a3, there's b4. And here I have to kind of deal with the rook invading, so I played rook a c1 to challenge the c file and the c2 square. And then here, black actually played b4, and this is actually a really critical position because essentially it would seem now that these knights are kind of trying to man the c3 square and kind of take over that file. And my queen all of a sudden is extremely offside, which is very, very scary. This is a critical position. There are actually many choices here for white, and it's kind of, you kind of have to think about what to do because black has some threats connected with the f2 pawn being sensitive, with the queen coming to the king side, and then again with the c3 being a sensitive square. So I thought for some time, and I wound up playing the move rook c4, but this actually turned out to be a mistake. Instead, there were two better moves, but one was clearly, I think, the best move, and that's probably the move rook takes c8. And the point is that after rook takes c8 and rook takes and knight d3, I'm kind of holding the squares together. Although you can see here, even this is quite dangerous because my queen now is way away from the king, and it seems like black has a free hand to kind of press the initiative on the king side. So this is an extremely precarious position, even if it is still fine for white. After what I did, after rook c4, rook takes e4, and b takes e4, you could see here that I am kind of crashing through if black does nothing. If the knight moves away very passively, let's say knight f6, rook d7 might be an option if the knight winds up not controlling that square. I do have the two bishops, so I do have the long-term trumps, and I can even kick this knight away with f3 and kind of start to take over. But Mark is a very, very good tactician and kind of recognized his chance here and played the remarkable knight takes f2. And all of a sudden, I'm in really, really significant trouble because my queen is just way too far away from my king to participate in the defense. And all of a sudden, black gets a very good initiative when I'm kind of lacking coordination. And so after knight takes f2, I played king takes f2. But now queen h4 check is a very, very dangerous check. And I already am kind of walking on eggshells, if I want to survive. It turns out here that the best move is actually king e2. And the point is that after king e2, queen h5 check, king e1, knight takes e3, and rook d7, I actually can survive. But to play in this type of fashion seems extremely difficult to see. And even here, the attack continues. It's not like it goes away. And this is the type of position where the computer's actually evaluating it as equal. But if you look at the position, it looks like a mess. And black has every opportunity to give a perpetual check at some point. So it seems very, very difficult to survive. So not a huge surprise, I think, that I didn't go for this. Instead, I went king g1, but this turns out to just not work. And the problem is that after knight takes e3, it's already much better for black. Now, the only move in the position now to kind of fight on is the move knight f3. But again, this does not make much sense. It's so difficult to find. The point is that after bishop takes f3, there's queen e5, hitting the pawn on g7 and also the knight on e3. But you can see your rook is also hanging and attacked twice. So it seems very strange that this would be the line. But the point is that after queen h6, rook d3, and knight g4, queen g3, and bishop e4, White manages to get some stability in the position even though he's 2 pawns down. So here, black is 2 pawns up, but white does have the 2 bishops, and this does give white some chances to hold. But I think in a practical game, black would probably win this type of position like 8 times out of 10. So yeah, you can see just how critical it was if I have to find all these only moves. I played the move rook c1 instead, just trying to hold my rook together. And if I get one move to consolidate, if my queen is able to move closer into the picture, into the frame, I'm able to hold. But now Mark struck with bishop takes g2, and this move is a winning move. Because after bishop takes g2, which pretty much I thought is obligatory, there's the move queen g5. And all of a sudden, there's a mating threat on g2. Black's going to get back one of the 2 pieces he's already sacrificed, and my king is completely naked and on the run. I played the move king f2, trying to run away, and after knight takes g2, I'm in huge trouble, although it was not the best move. I actually saw this position from afar, and I realized that there's a move here that wins for black on the spot, and I was actually ready to resign if this was played. The move f6 just wins on the spot, and the reason for that is my knight can't really move because it's pinned, and there's still f takes e5 check threats now getting the rook in the game, and the bishop on g2 is still hanging. So in one fell swoop, all my counterplay or chances to hold would be gone, and even the bishop on this diagonal would now be restricted because the f6 move cuts off the bishop from the g7 square. So that would have been a huge big-time move that would have held everything together. Instead, after not playing f6, I managed to play a little bit longer after queen takes b4, and I'm actually able to keep the fight going. Here, after queen takes, black played the move knight f4, and you can see here it's already very dangerous. There's queen takes e5 and knight d3 check ideas with a royal forks everywhere, and my king is on the run. I played queen c3. f6 now was played. It's still a good move, blocking out my queen and bishop. And after knight f3, queen c5 check, king f1, rook d8, knight e1, and queen f5, I'm still lost because my knight and king are really not great defenders here. My bishop is really out of play, and these pieces are enough to checkmate me. So it's really, really a tough spot. Now, the only thing I had going for me in this position was that I was actually up on time, and what that meant is that I actually got some chances to try and play on the time factor. So what I was trying to do is play as quickly as possible and make it difficult for him to finish me off. And so after queen f5, I very quickly played queen f3 to stop the discoveries. And then after rook d2, I very quickly played the move bishop a3. And even though the position is pretty much critical, and you can see my king is really only has one square, I tried to just keep the game going a little bit. And somehow, some way, I actually managed to hold. Black played the move rook takes h2, collecting a third pawn for the piece. Now the material is not even, now black's not even down material. And after bishop d6, e5, I actually got a diagonal to work with some checks, so I tried to rush to get some counterplay, and I played the move rook c3. And my idea here was to defend against rook h3, which I thought was a serious threat, by now having queen a8 check and rook takes h3. The position is still winning for black, and the move that should have been played was the move h5. I really only have one check, and after queen a8 check, king h7, there's all types of discoveries going on, and I simply can't hold the fort. I mean, if I go back to f3, white can even play black can even play h4 and continue to shove the pawn down the board, and the position is just lost. But for some reason, well, not for some reason, in the time trouble that Mark had, he actually played the move rook h3, and this gave me a miracle reprieve, because now I can play queen a8 check, king f7, and after queen b7 check, king g6, I could play rook takes h3. And all of a sudden, I'm still a piece up. I do have what you may consider to be a dangerous c-pawn, and my queen can now come back to the king side in one fell swoop and try to defend. And after queen takes h3 check, king f2, there's no clear win or attack even, because my queen guards the relevant squares on this diagonal around my king. And so here, Mark was actually down to his last 30 seconds, and actually after king f2, he actually decided to repeat because he saw that he actually didn't have any clear-cut forced win, and he was down on time. It turns out that there were a few ways to try to press the position, and if I were him, I think I would have pressed because I could take a draw whenever. And so h5 was actually an option, and knight h5 was an option. But after the repetition, he repeated a third time, I was more than happy to claim a draw because I realized that my position was simply terrible and that this was a really nice escape. So, yeah, it was a second long game in a row. Not as long as the first one, but it was actually the last game to end in round 2. And fortunately, it ended a little bit differently, even though I probably should have lost it. Now, at the same time, I was winning earlier in the game, so it was annoying to kind of miss that chance and to kind of spoil up even a risk-free position with the two bishops. But I was really glad at least not to lose and to somewhat stabilize given the drama of a very emotional first day of chess. So, anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.